So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers, Teresa Miranda and John Koenig. Teresa is a senior advisor for the Office of Finance at the Department of Health and Human Services. She has nearly 30 years of accounting experience, 13 of those with the federal government. She is well versed in the accounting cycle, particularly with the generation of the AFR, which a lot of us are going to be transitioning to right after this. We all very much enjoy it, and especially with CARES Act, it's going to be extra fun this year. Another speaker is John Koenig. He's a former colonel with the U.S. Marine Corps with 20 years of experience. He is an expert, and an underlined expert, in audit readiness for the Department of Defense and is very intimately familiar with developing internal controls around the,
Around the CERT program in Iraq, yes.
Yes, Commander's Emergency Response Program in Iraq. So he actually has very direct experience in dealing with management override as a result of this program. And so with that, again, thank you for being here. And John, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Inga. Again, good afternoon and welcome to our presentation. Just to real quickly go over the agenda that we're going to cover here this afternoon. We're going to talk a little bit about how do you know that you've gotten into a situation where management override is going to intrude into your day-to-day activities, and how do you recognize it, and then how do you adjust to it. We'll talk about the inevitable aspects of what we call downrange impacts that will naturally occur as a result of the things you have to do to not only be responsive to the application of management override, but also to the larger mandates of whatever the crisis or situation you find yourself in. And then in terms of what do you draw from that in terms of lessons, and how do you feed that back into your particular organization in terms of staying balanced for the next event, in terms of either your human capital management, technology, or procedures and processes that you might be able to learn some lessons from that, and then make sure you're ready for the next event. And then, of course, we'll end with some the typical question and answer session. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. So we have three basic objectives here today. The first, of course, is that it's critical that how do you know when you've entered into that new environment where management override is going to probably occur. And so you want to, we're going to talk a little bit about how that occurs and how to recognize it, and then also how to help start managing it. In terms of understanding the activities you're going to be applying in that scenario, some sort of activities or flexibilities or other relief in your day-to-day internal controls activities that you're going to put in place during that crisis when management override is occurring, and you know that will solve the problem for that day. But every solution then is somebody else's, the start of somebody else's problem, so to speak. And so, and I think one of the things we'll talk about is that's what's going to happen, and you almost have to give yourself permission for recognizing that, but capturing what you know at the time, so that you're better prepared for dealing with the consequences, the mitigation, or the other activities you'll have to put in place downstream. And then lastly, we'll cover a couple lessons learned so that you can be more prepared for managing the now, that you're better able to incorporate those capabilities and procedures for the next crisis. You can go to the next slide. So when we look at management override, there's probably three major areas that we see how it plays out in aggregate. In terms of that bypassing that internal control, it's going to have some sort of consequence. Okay, those internal controls, as we all know, are put in place for a variety of reasons. Could be a policy, could be statutory, could be best practice, could be industry best practice, things like that. And they all have a reason for being there. And of course, most of us are always looking for those opportunities to tighten up our controls, lean out unnecessary controls, look for opportunities to make sure that they're the most effective and efficient and having the least impact on our day-to-day business operations and not being an undue burden. So they're there for a reason in the grand scheme of things. So when a management override situation occurs, and we'll talk about a couple of examples of that here shortly, but when those events occur, for whatever variety of reasons, the consequences of that, in order to get something done outside of the norm, is going to lead to, it's going to cause some outcome. So that bypassing then leads to a causal activity which then plays out further in a result in terms of either your business activities, the mission of the organization, the outcomes and processes, the reason that your organization exists, whether it's serving clients, serving customers, producing a product, delivering a good, delivering a service. So that's our general view of a lens of how to look at it. So how does that play out in three basic areas of consequence? First one, of course, is that area of errors. And so if there are internal controls that you have in place to reduce error, you're going to then see a rise in those errors in whatever business activity you're managing. That can then lead to errors in the aggregation of data or other activities that you aggregate. And so the result of that is that poor data quality then will unfortunately drive either uninformed decisions, partially informed decisions, misinformed decisions, and that, of course, can result in the sorts of decisions that do not help you with, whether it's managing anything from an inventory control issue, or in some cases the application of policy or services and the like. So, and in the worst case, it may be limited internally, but in the worst case, it could have consequences in terms of your relationship with your client, your presence in the market, or in a non-commercial sense, could be in terms of your reputation within the marketplace. Second one is non-compliance, and of course, if you're having to bypass an internal control that is required for some compliance reasons, obviously that then leads you to a vulnerability in a subsequent audit. Now, there's lots of ways to work around that in terms of how you better engage the auditors when they arrive and the like, and that's part of that process. But obviously, the worst case is you're going to nonetheless have an audit finding, and that results in loss of time subsequently down road. So besides just the general embarrassment, for want of a better word, or just the angst for having had an audit finding, you then have to then put in place, obviously, corrective action plans and in some way address it in some way, shape, or form. And that's obviously energy, time, and resources that could be better spent on something else within your organization. And then finally, last case is obviously the third rail of these situations, is to find yourself in a position where your organization now, because of a management override and the loss of internal controls, you now have a situation where some sort of fraud, waste, or abuse has occurred. In the case of a federal organization, you have congressional oversight, OIG issues. If you're in the commercial sector, obviously you're dealing now with all sorts of legal and similar vulnerabilities, and of course that then becomes an issue that you have to then address downstream. Next slide, please. So how do you find yourself in these situations where, how does it happen? So obviously on the right side in our blue box here, and there's many other things you could probably be thrown in there, but these are the general reasons why we have internal controls in process. They're existing. In many cases, they're part of our daily routine, weekly, monthly, annual routines, and they're there because they're good business, bottom line. But something occurs, an accident, emergency, early in our career, it's going to seem like the biggest thing. It may not necessarily even be an organizational level emergency. It may just be your particular business unit that has that, or your section. But ultimately, in some cases, and we'll talk about here in a moment, they can be quite large, historic, and or at least in terms of your market or something like that, or your particular portion of an organization. And so this is where things, and the way I describe it is there's sort of a level of urgency, obviously, and certainly the most pressing reason that management override would occur is when you have risk to life. And so there's plenty of examples of that where, right now we're dealing with a pandemic. In other cases, you're dealing with a natural disaster. In other cases, you're dealing with a medical procedure that needs to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. And there are many other examples of that, but something where human life is at risk and something needs to be done immediately to fix that. And then the second level is obviously in terms of resources made available to an organization, resources that need to be moved quickly, resources that need to be made available to other folks, other people, individuals, organizations, institutions. And in that case, is the press of time as opposed to human life and safety can become a factor in the grand scheme of things. And so, and then lastly, maybe it might be a drive for economization of some sort, economization of resources, economization of economizing on time, resources, and the like. So all these things in various ways somehow outweigh the day-to-day processes that we put in place, and we find ourselves in a moment where we have to be flexible, adjust, work around, or otherwise account for an internal control that we cannot do for some reason or not. So then how does that play out historically in terms of understanding that you've got yourself in an area where you're probably subjected to management override? If we can go to the next slide, Inga. So here's a couple examples just going back to 2009. Many of you on the call may have been involved and in the workforce at the time when the Recovery Act occurred in 2009 following the financial missteps that occurred in 2008 timeframe, and we had some serious economic problems, and so there's a massive infusion of funding into the economy through the federal government. So that was one example where many elements of the federal government and then down into the states and other organizations and throughout really ultimately the entire economy there's an injection of capital, and there are various ways that because of the need of time, and whatnot, there were a lot of areas where management override required the expeditious disbursement of these funds. And you can see across this slide other examples since then of where many of these challenges occurred over time. But also you'll see in this list too also where, as a natural consequence of some of these initiatives or the lessons learned that came out of a prior crisis, that there was then an initiative to put in place new procedures, new requirements, new investments of effort to acquire capability. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, you see there, there's this balancing act of people, process, and technology that helps an organization deal with these management overrides over time. And so as you have, as you go into a crisis, you're going to find that the preparations you've made for your workforce put you in a position to respond more agilely than might otherwise be the case. If you've made those investments, in other cases, you may not be as agile as you would like to be, in which case you'll see a gap in performance, a gap in capability that you're probably going to want to address afterwards. In terms of processes, those reconfiguration of processes, the over time transition from manual to automated processes that has occurred really in all industries is also an opportunity. It's also sometimes a constraint. And so to the extent that you've learned from a prior management override situation to forward fit future flexibility in your systems is something that we all look for coming out of these management override events. And then lastly, that use of effective technology. And I think there's several examples just in our current environment where we've had IT systems have to go to scale to support remote workforces and the like. So those are some examples of where the underlying activities of people and processes and technology has enabled organizations to deal with these management override situations more agilely than would otherwise be the case. And in some cases, also are the beneficiaries or the recipients of the lessons learned that occur from those crises that then are rolled into process improvement activities and other similar initiatives to make sure that the organization is ready for the next opportunity. And then I'll go to one more slide here, and then we'll take a break for some questions. So in terms of some lessons, this is just an example here of one shot of how, as you're coming out of a management override situation, you're going to want to go back and say, okay, so what did we learn, and what do we need to take forward? And I want to hasten to add that's I think probably one of the key things to remember wherever you are. You have a lot of company. You have a lot of company in some respects. You have a lot of company in terms of in that particular moment, that particular event, where you're having to manage around internal controls, maybe have to shut them down for a while to then reconstitute them later, or having to put in place new ones because you have a new initiative that you're being responsible for executing. In that time and place, you have a lot of your fellow colleagues particularly if it's a large enterprise crisis. But you also have history. And so TARP and the American Recovery Act is, I think, a good example of history that a lot of people drew a lot of lessons out of, and they brought them forward over the last 11 years. And in some respects, they have some of those lessons have served us well in the last 6 to 7 months. So when we look at lessons, and I know the participants here can read the chart, and I'm not going to read every one of these, but we tend to look at them in terms of the overall structures that are in place, the processes, the strategies that undergird that, and then obviously most important is the people that actually execute all these things, and then the technology that to varying degrees enables folks to do that. And as you can see, as you go from left to right, we kind of look through, hey, there's always the bright spots. There's the things that worked very well because people were ready, procedures were in place, there was good communications internally. There's all sorts of various permutations of how that will look in that particular organization, in that particular time, in that particular crisis where management override has to occur. And then there's also the things that, hey, what could we have done better? In most cases, there will be a couple gaps that are only handled by rearranging people, having to have a crisis of putting in maybe new procedures that maybe weren't required before, and there isn't something that you can sort of cut and paste or leverage from an existing process, and you may have to build something out of whole cloth. But those tend to normally be, to some degree, relatively small. But in looking at where you can improve, those are those opportunities to say, okay, so what's the likelihood of that management override situation occurring in the future, and therefore, based on that assessment, how much do we need to invest on that prospect? And so, having that hard effort and investment of time on the lessons learned really starts on day one, because you're going to be making some of those decisions at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night that okay, I know I have to do this, but I know what I'm doing to myself. And there's going to be someone in your organization that does. And that may be nothing more than scratching it out on a yellow sticky and throwing it in your drawer to be pulled out at some point in the future because things are just going that fast. And again, that's something that's just the way it is oftentimes. And you have to be kind to yourself if no one else, but capture those things even in the moment to the extent you can, because at some point you will get a breather. You will have 1 more hour of sleep one night at some point when you get through that basic crisis. And even if you're having to sit there and pull pieces of paper out of your sock drawer and from the glove compartment of your car and stuff like that, you do want to be able to pull those things together, because you do want to, even while you're still recovering from the surge you went through, you do want to capture those thoughts because you're going to want to go back at them at some point and invest in a more deliberate thought process about what you learned and what you can take forward into the future. So with that, those are some general comments, and Teresa's going to talk about some specific examples in a moment. But I think, Inga, are we going to do questions now for a few minutes? Or are we saving that for the end?
So if anyone has any questions, again, please put them in the polling tab, and we'll leave it open for about 30 seconds. But if we don't see anything else, then we'll save the question that is on there for the end.
All right, I guess not having received any questions at this point in time, that's fine. I'll take it over from here. So thank you, John, for that history lesson in some lessons learned from previous situations. And what I'd like to do is just kind of walk us through on how we can manage the cycle of responding to situations like that. Emergency situations do come up, and there are going to be situations where we're going to subvert our internal controls if we're faced with that speed to deliver the mission of the program. Especially with limited time and resources, we're going to consider overriding controls and bypassing procedures just to adequately respond to a crisis. So we'll walk through this particular cycle. The first thing that we want to do is recognize that the event has occurred. And at this stage, we're going to consider what processes and what technology do we have in place to be able to respond to that particular situation. And then the next step would be to think about it as we're in that moment. Who are the people that are going to be there to respond to this crisis? What can we do to consider improving the communication, empathizing with the folks that are in the moment, because we know that the first human natural response is to panic, but we don't want people to panic. We want to help them accelerate and prioritize the situation. Regular check-ins, that would be a good suggestion. Quick guides to kind of help add some relief to some folks. And in the most recent events, we've all learned in the past 6 months there are many ways that we can stay connected. Many of us have had to learn by fire how to use Zoom, GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, Google Meeting. I'm sure I've missed quite a few that are out there, but there are many ways to stay connected. We've got features where we can text with folks. So any way that we can stay connected with folks will be a great thing to help calm those that are responding to the situation. And then the next steps in the cycle would be steps 3 and 4, which are really lessons learned in how we address the situation, and then documenting them to make sure that when we experience the next situation, that we could easily, make the next situation a little bit easier for us and be able to implement that. All right, let's go to the next slide, Inga. Thank you. All right, so here we've got a scenario where speed and delivery are important. We've got a situation here where I will recognize the event, and here we've got a crisis where an emergency building repairs are needed and a budget estimate is required. Here the request is that we submit a budget request with cost estimates to OMB within 48 hours. Now, I can assimilate this situation to more of that public health and safety situation where we do need to respond quickly and deliver as quickly as we could in this situation. So let's see what Megan and Ken would experience. These are the people that are dealing with this situation in the moment. We've got Megan, who is a young professional, and she's probably excited or unsure, and this is going to be her first experience with an emergency response. And then we've got Ken on the other side, who might be annoyed, but he's prepared because he's got 25 years of experience. He's been through this, but maybe it's one of those situations where Ken, although he may be experienced in addressing responses, he might not be the best in documentation. So he's one of those that might be kind of winging it through based on his previous experiences. So we can have situations in this scenario where the examples of internal controls that might be subverted would be areas where perhaps that the estimates that we developed might not be as complete because we've got a quick response rate that we've got to turn around. And the data at the time may not be the best available, but again, given the time and the speed to which we have to respond, it may not be as complete. So the review process could also be cut short or not as thorough due to the timing of the response. So particular lessons learned from this example would be that we would want to document the things that maybe Ken wasn't as great about, and with Megan teamed up with him because she is new to this process. Maybe she was eager to write down notes as she was learning through the process. We can also have a look back scenario. We can go back to the information that we thought was incomplete and maybe kind of do another reassessment to determine whether or not, in fact, it was material or significant enough to be to have an influence into management's decision. So that could be some examples from there. And then the best practice, again, picking on Ken, is make sure that we carve out enough time to document the items when he's been managing through the particular process, so that as Megan, for example, who might be eager to jump back into the work that was delayed, it might be helpful for her to kind of capture some of the things that Ken was working through and addressing to the response. So I kind of assimilate this scenario to where we are to today's environment, where there was a rapid response to address the pandemic. So late March, early April, when the federal government was doing its best to quickly respond, we were in the moment, trying to react. Probably had quite a few people, and you can see it in the healthcare workers. They're just tired. They're trying to get through the situation, and we're all just doing the best that we can to make sure that we support them. We empathize what they're going through and try our best to make sure that we communicate that support for them. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. And this particular scenario, while it may be, considered a crisis, it's a scenario where the response may not be as rapid, but the crisis or the emergency is just as critical. And, in this situation where I will recognize the event, it's where Congress is funding a new program with unique requirements, and payments need to go out as soon as possible. And the request here is to develop the department-wide guidance to process transactions while maintaining effectiveness of ongoing operations, processes, controls, and legislatively mandated responsibilities. We'll need to realign existing resources to integrate new funding and program requirements, such as timelines for obligations, expenditures, reporting requirements, etc. So let's consider the people that are involved in this in the moment. And we'll look at Chaidi and Julia. So with Chaidi and Julia, they seem to be seasoned staff members. Chaidi, he could be anxious and overwhelmed because he's thinking he's going through another experience of an emergency response. But yet we've got Julia, who again, she's a little bit more seasoned. She's got 20 years of experience, and she might be a little bit more confident because she's thinking, I've got this. Not so much of a panic situation. So seasoned professionals, they could be taking the lead into the situation. And, as John had kind of described in some of those previous historical lessons learned, where we've kind of improved over time. And that's where Chaidi and Julia may believe that they've got, a good handle on this. With this being a new program, there could be situations where internal controls could be subverted. Again, it could be where some reviews might be bypassed because of the limited resources. Again, you've got two seasoned folks that are involved in the process here, but we may not have enough of the resources and staffing to be able to go through all the documentation or the development of this guidance that's been asked of us. There could be workarounds that weren't discussed, but that could be that situation where we're kind of flying the plane and building it at the same time. And I know many of us are feeling that in this current environment of the COVID response, where we're rapidly responding to address an economic crisis. But in this type of scenario, that could be a longer haul instead, because economic crisis and trying to deal with that takes a longer path. So in this situation, there could be elements that kind of adjust our internal control environment. Let's say that, and we're experiencing this right now, where there's going to be changes in regulations and requirements. And authorities might have some flexibilities that they've once required of us, as far as audit compliance and things like that. But now that there might be some relaxing rules and regulations, and many people are experiencing that now as we're trying to kind of work through this economic crisis together. Again, lessons learned as we're experiencing this is perhaps leverage existing processes, learn from history, gain from that, and then obviously we're not at that stage yet, but in an economic crisis that we're dealing with right now, there's going to be some downrange impact. There's going to be this long-range, downrange impact. We're going to perform look-backs, look at the decisions that were made in this year that we might not see until next year. So this is where it's going to be important for us to do a quality assurance review, of the decisions that we made in time, make sure that we document that as well. And again, with Chaiti and Julie on board responding to this, they may have a great handle on that documentation process. But the key thing is to make sure that we're doing this, that we're documenting this while everything is still fresh in mind. And John had mentioned this, even if it's to pull out those sticky notes that we left in the drawer, that might come in handy to kind of help trigger some of those thoughts and decisions that we made at the time. You know, I've learned over these past 6 months to actually use Microsoft OneNote. That has been one of those lessons that I've learned along the way as we're encountering meetings on the fly, when we're having these regular check-ins. I'm actually documenting as we're having these meetings, and it was one of those situations where had to leave the office unexpectedly, didn't realize that I left some of my notebooks and things like that, and you know, again, learned to be flexible in the moment, and taught myself how to use OneNote in an efficient way. So I'm very comfortable with some of these the features that we actually have in technology. So let's move on to the next slide. So what's next? As individuals, I gave an example of the best way to kind of document some of those decisions. Use technology to the best that you can. Make sure that you can set up centrally frequently asked questions in a central repository. Again, we've got Microsoft Teams. That has been a wonderful tool for many of us to use. You've got SharePoint. You've got areas where we can all centralize our information. Again, especially because we're now in an environment where we're working virtually and we don't have the access to someone's bookshelf and the information, and we've all just learned to share it that way. And again, that might kind of lean over into organizations where, as an organization, we've learned to kind of share information better. We've learned to control some of the communications and develop Tiger teams. And again, Teams. I'm going to keep, not that I'm trying to pitch Microsoft Teams, but that has been a wonderful tool that we've all learned to use on the fly. So those are just things that we should consider to minimize that overuse of management override. But you know, many of us in the audience are familiar with audits. You know, it's guaranteed that you're going to have auditors whether they're internal or external, they're going to ask you for your documentation. So even if it's a sticky note to say, hey, you know, here's what I was thinking at the moment. I might not have fully documented it out, but at least it could start the conversation. And I know auditors are comfortable with at least starting with a conversation so they can understand what some of those decisions were at that time. So, you know, again, management override, sometimes necessary, but overuse can undermine the internal control environment that underpins an organization's activities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Inga for any Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Teresa and John. So we do have some questions. First question.
Right.
If an internal control is frequently overridden, is that a sign that it may be poorly designed?
Do you want to go first, Teresa, or would you like me to?
Actually, I would say yes, because I think that we actually reflected that on one of those earlier slides where, you know, pervasive errors could lead to poor data quality. And you know, that certainly is not something that we would want to encourage, right?
Yeah, no, I would add just that I think that it probably is a candidate for some modification. So it may be that it's, yep, if it's not providing value add and no one it's being constantly overridden or in some way circumvented, then that's probably an indication that it's probably a candidate for some sort of a leaning review to see if it's something you can be done with. Sure.
All right, thank you guys. All right, so our next question is, how do you get people to understand if they override a control, this is an exception and must have reasons documented?
I'm sorry, so the question is related to helping someone understand why you've overridden a particular, or why management has overridden a process?
Yes. Why Why did they override it, and how then they have to document why they did it?
So I'll go first, Teresa, if you'd like. I think obviously the specifics in any one of those situations matters a great deal. It depends on who's telling you to override, for starters, and what their authorities and responsibilities are. So there's that piece of the sort of the answer, and then I think at some point that individual may be in a pure management role, or who's demanded that management override. They may not necessarily be all that concerned, quite frankly, with the internal control, because they're presuming it's happening. I mean, I think a good example is segregation of duties. Most people, most senior managers are blissfully ignorant of most segregation of duty activities that go on within an organization. So then it's really for the direct management, that's, you know, the leadership that's directly involved with responsibility for something like segregation of duties, to have to go back and say, hey, boss, you know, when you do that on a routine basis, you're undercutting this, and it's making us vulnerable in some respect. So actually, apropos of the first question, if you have a good internal control, there's a consequence for not following it. Okay, and that's, I think, the essence of this conversation here is capturing that, knowing that when you've overridden it, you're going to have to go back and somehow reconstitute it, or clean it up, or put in some subsequent activities to account for it. But if it's a viable and good internal control, then it should be at some point relatively easy to have conversation with the right level of management to explain the consequences of working around it, and why you need to go back to it at some point in the future. Teresa?
No, I think that's actually a great point. You know, there have been situations where, you know, again, I've been on the receiving end where auditors would come to me and ask me questions of, well, why did you override this particular process? And, you know, okay, there have been situations where, oops, we made that mistake, but more often than not, there was a justifiable reason. And by just having that conversation, or that evidence of the reasons for that, you know, it's been fine. I mean, even though you might still get dinged for the fact that you might have bypassed an internal control, there was no intent for there to be any fraud, waste, or abuse. So I think that's also that balance that we consider.
All right. So our next question is, what are some ways to help manage and balance the pressures from various levels and stakeholders when you're in the moment?
I'm happy to go first. I think the first one is communications, I think, key. And that communications has to be somewhat segmented, if that makes any sense, in terms of, you have to take a look at the management organization. Does it have, what's the maturity of the existing governance processes that you have in place? That may be the quickest way to have some of those conversations. In other cases, you're going to have to have sort of some of these one-off conversations with the group. So I think that's probably first and foremost, because the more individuals understand the consequences, and that sharing of information and that establishment of transparency, I think is probably the most effective way to get started through that process that's inherent in the question. Teresa, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
Yes, I'd like to add to that. So, you know, in addition to the communication, sometimes it's through communication that as a team, you may realize, as far as trying to do that balancing act of trying to respond, you know, there could be a situation where, as you communicate and you understand what the situation might be, it could perhaps be that an individual might need just a little bit of extra help in working through something. So I think through communication, it helps us as colleagues to help pitch in there where necessary. Because again, I think that empathy and understanding for those that are in the moment and responding, then it makes a world of difference. And I will give that example of where we were back in April, where everybody had to quickly respond to not only was it just a change in the working environment, but even to actually respond to to the crisis. where we just knew that our colleagues in one arm of the organization, they all had to jump in quickly. And then we're just kind of waiting on the outskirts for the information to come to us. But instead of waiting, we thought, okay, while we're in this waiting period, is there something that we can do to help you? Maybe it's that documentation. Maybe it's just being there to listen to the conversations and help with that documentation. So that also is a relief. Even if it comes down to, I just need to have somebody make copies of something, we're all going to chip in. But again, through communication, that's the only way that you're going to understand what your other partners might be experiencing. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. So second to last question, what are some ways you found to get management buy-in to implement your recommendations?
Teresa, you want to go first? I do have some thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say other ways that we've learned to get management buy-in. I mean, obviously is, if you could actually present or demonstrate some results, that's always a quick win, right? If you can demonstrate that you're going to have results from the process, that's great. For us, within HHS, I can give that example that we're a very collaborative group. So if we can demonstrate that we've, communicated with all the key stakeholders in the process, that's also, a good thing to make sure that we've done our due diligence. Those are the things that we've demonstrated to management to help them get their buy-in. And the last thing I can add in there is about leveraging existing processes. So if, again, through our due diligence and understanding of how we can respond to something, leveraging an existing process that works has always been a successful thing for us as well.
Yeah, I just to add to Teresa's comments, I think one of the data and facts I think are probably your best weapons. Mm-hmm. I think in the financial community, you're also armed with, you have some well-regarded sets of certifications that demonstrate expertise, and so bringing the right folks in to help you with crafting that message to management is a big part of that. Inga mentioned at the beginning when I years ago went to Iraq. I was in Western Iraq in Anbar province, and one of the things I was responsible for was the Commander's Emergency Response Program, which was a relatively new initiative at the time, where they were providing cash, Iraqi dinars in most cases, to frontline commanders, young company commanders, platoon commanders, and the like. Just as a point of comparison, a 500-pound bomb roughly costs the American government about $2,000. But you could have a young American go into a place like Fallujah or Ramadi, and with the judicious use of $500 worth of Iraqi dinar, really kind of start things on the ground in terms of basic things like just cleaning the streets or opening up basic facilities. And then also we had a lot of funds in terms of availability to get just fresh water available to local tribesmen and things like that. Well, that was a lot of money that we were being spent. When I showed up, we had virtually no processes in place, nothing that most people would recognize as internal control. And to the point of communications, the head of manpower for our organization based there in Western Iraq, one day he calls me up like 7 o'clock at night. He says, "Hey, John, would you come by for a second?" And he hands me this resume. We had, I think some of the callers may know about the Center for Naval Analysis, and we were having an augmentee was going to come from there. And she just happened, talking about, gold falling in your lap, she had a Harvard MBA. And I said, I know what I can do with this person. And so she showed up and I had her go through our entire process, gave her about a month to do that. And then she came back with a set of recommendations on putting internal controls in place. We had put in some governance processes in place. But most importantly, we were also able to give some basics on the payoff of this program and what it was doing on the ground and why it was valuable to the generals who were ultimately responsible for it. So I think it's those kinds of things like that you have to be, for want of a better word, a salesman to some degree. I mean, you're asking for an establishment of an internal control or the maintenance of it for a reason, and you should be able to demonstrate that to the neophytes out there that are not financial managers why it's good business to do that. So hopefully that's a good answer, a helpful answer to your question.
Okay, guys, and our last question. So what's a good way to get some lessons learned from experienced responders before they retire or move to other areas?
Like Ken, in that example that I had.
Like Ken or like John when he finally left the Marine Corps?
Oh, true, right?
Yeah, I can give you in the Marine Corps and the DoD space, they do have invested some effort into that. So there are in DoD there's various lessons learned programs that are in place. That some of them are web enabled. In other cases like that, in other cases they will have, like in Iraq when I was there, we had a command historian. And so for certain individuals, you had to check out with them, and so that was ended up being about a 2-hour debrief, and all sorts of information was captured in terms of best practices and the like before you left. And then I think also more at the personal level, when any one of us leaves an organization, retire, whatever the case is, someone's coming up behind you, and I think that's probably the other thing is how are you developing your and mentoring your subordinates, and that's not a responsibility of the organization so much, although may try to encourage that, but each one of us, I think if you're a good leader, good manager, you probably at some level have a genuine interest in the success of your team, and so it's somewhat on each of us to share that information before we leave in some way, shape, or form. And yes, sadly, some of it will end up being at the bottom of the desk or in that bookcase in the corner that no one looks at, or hidden away on a shared drive someplace until suddenly somebody's looking for it at 8 o'clock at night 5 years later, or whatever the case is. So some of that will go on and will be unappreciated at the time. But I think institutionally there's methodologies, and I think also as individuals, we often owe it to the people we've worked with to leave something behind for that. Turn it over to Teresa for any other thoughts or ideas.
Actually, I would echo what you were saying about mentoring individuals, because I think that, I joke around about that situation in that previous scenario where, Ken was the more senior person. He might not have been, the best at documenting, and it could have been that, and I forgot the person, Julia, that was paired with him. Or Megan, excuse me. Megan was the one that was paired with Ken. But, you could have it where the junior staff, or the early professional could be shadowing folks like that, and that could help with the documentation process. So just pairing up people within organizations. And, I think as a federal government too, or even just with state governments too, I think we've gotten so much better about sharing information and getting those lessons learned. So even internally, if we may do some, have a process, internal control processes performed in a certain way, I think that lessons learned, just the way that technology has been with information sharing has been fantastic.
All right, well, thank you, John and Teresa. And so with that, we wrap up this session for this year's internal control and fraud prevention training in 2020. We thank you again for spending these 50 minutes with us. We hope you've enjoyed this entire 2-day training session and you've gotten a lot of good information. Before you go, we would appreciate if you could please evaluate this training. It's the blue button again in the questions and polling tab. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe out there and have a great rest of the year.